The desert is never truly silent. At first, it seems so, a vast, unbroken stillness, stretching to the horizon, the kind of silence that presses against the ears until your own heartbeat becomes the loudest thing you hear. But if you wait, if you stand long enough under the soft orange wash of a dying sun, you will hear it, the faint hiss of sand moving across itself, the sigh of the wind threading through low dunes, the occasional crack of a stone splitting in the heat. The desert speaks in whispers, but only to those patient enough to listen. On the evening our story begins, the wind was restless. It pushed small thin veils of sand along the ground in nervous patterns, as though something deep beneath the surface was exhaling. The excavation camp sat at the edge of a shallow basin, where the dunes sloped inward like the walls of a bowl. Lantern light from the tents quivered in the heat haze, their glow slowly surrendering to the encroaching dark. To the untrained eye, this place was unremarkable. No towering statues marked it, no weathered columns jutted from the ground to announce a forgotten temple, just sand and more sand, an endless repetition, hypnotic in its simplicity. And yet, under this deceptive plainness, there was something that didn't belong. Something no map should have led anyone to. The team here was small, a handful of seasoned archaeologists, 2 hired local guides, and 1 quiet, silver-haired man who had no official title on the permit, but whose name carried weight in certain academic circles. They worked in muted coordination, their shovels biting into the ground, the scrape of metal against packed earth occasionally punctuated by short, murmured exchanges. Every so often, one of them would pause to tilt their head, as though listening for a cue, a hollow change in the sound of the spade perhaps, or the faintest vibration beneath their boots. The wind grew cooler as night approached, sweeping across the camp and carrying with it the sharp, mineral scent of disturbed soil. One of the guides, a man with sun-creased skin and the watchful gaze of someone who had grown up in these sands, stepped away from the work and looked toward the horizon. "The desert remembers," he said in Arabic, more to himself than to anyone else. No one responded, but a few glanced at him, then back to their work. It was a strange expedition from the start. There were no official museum backers, no university banners fluttering in the wind. Funding had come from somewhere private, whispered about but never explained in the open. The coordinates had been taken from a brittle parchment, a map whose origin had been the subject of heated debate and careful secrecy. And what it promised, if the markings were true, was impossible: a tomb where no pharaoh had ever been buried, in a region thought to have been lifeless during Egypt's great dynastic reigns. The dig had begun slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the desert itself was resisting intrusion. Hours passed with nothing to show but the steady deepening of the trench. But just before the sun began to kiss the horizon, the first hint appeared, a clean, deliberate edge of stone emerging from beneath the sand. Not a natural boulder, not a jagged fragment, but something cut and placed, its angle too perfect to be an accident. Lanterns were lit early that night, their glow catching the faces of the team as they cleared more of the surface. Carvings began to appear, worn but still distinct under the drifting dust. They were not hieroglyphics, at least not in any form familiar to the Egyptologists on site. The lines were sharper, the curves more alien. One symbol, repeated 3 times along the exposed stone, looked like an eye enclosed in a spiral. Someone remarked quietly that it didn't belong here, that it looked more at home in the iconography of cultures thousands of miles away. The silver-haired man said nothing, only brushing his fingers lightly across the carved surface, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. The night deepened. The sky above bloomed with stars so bright, they seemed almost close enough to touch, the Milky Way spilling across the black like powdered bone. In the glow of the lanterns, the dig site became a hollow of gold light, surrounded by a sea of shadow. The sound of the shovels slowed, not from fatigue, but from something else, a quiet recognition that whatever they were uncovering was about to cross the threshold from theory into reality. And then the final shovel stroke for the night, a hollow echo from beneath, sharp and resonant, as though the earth itself had answered back. The silver-haired man's head lifted. Around him, the team froze, even the wind seemed to pause. It is in these moments, brief suspended instants before the unknown becomes known, that the world seems to hold its breath. Here, under an ocean of stars, in a place no map should have led to, the first whispers of the tomb reached the surface. They did not speak in words, but in the soft, slow language of the earth, promising secrets that should not exist. What they did not yet know was that the deeper they dug, the more the boundaries of history would fray, until the line between what had been and what could never have been would all but disappear. History is usually found in the ground, in stone, in clay, in the compacted layers of soil that hold the weight of centuries. Rarely does it begin in paper. And yet, in this case, it started with something far more fragile, a single crumbling sheet of parchment that had slept in the shadows for hundreds of years. It was discovered not in the sands of Egypt, but in a dim, wood-paneled room in a private collection in southern Europe. The owner, an aging collector of rare manuscripts, had acquired it decades earlier through channels as obscure as the map itself. For years, it had been filed away as a curiosity, a weathered scrap marked with faded lines, strange symbols, and an ink so dark it seemed to drink the light. It wasn't until a visiting academic, a linguist, known for his work on Proto-Semitic scripts, saw it that its significance began to stir. He noticed something immediately. The parchment contained no language he could definitively place, and yet the angular lines and spiral motifs seemed to echo across multiple ancient cultures. More curious still, the parchment bore a date in Roman numerals, inked in a later hand, 1522. That was the year recorded, but the material itself tested far older, at least a millennium before that inscription was added. The map's centerpiece was an expanse of beige, interrupted by sweeping curves, and a long twisting mark, resembling a river. There was no Nile, no Red Sea, no recognizable topography that could tie it neatly to any known location, but in the lower right corner, pressed into the parchment in what looked like iron oxide, was a small series of marks, coordinates, though not in the form we know today. They were positional, astronomical, measuring from fixed stars rather than a globe. For centuries, no one had bothered to trace them. Most dismissed the map as a work of fiction, perhaps a cartographer's daydream from the age of exploration. Yet in the hands of a modern researcher with satellite imaging software, those coordinates resolved themselves with startling precision to a barren stretch of the western desert in Egypt, far from the Nile, far from any known settlement in the dynastic era. This, of course, should have been the end of the matter, a curious alignment, a cartographic coincidence, but the problem was that the site the coordinates pointed to had never been marked on any Egyptian record. No tombs, no temples, no agricultural traces, nothing. The silver-haired man, whose quiet presence would later become central to the excavation, first saw the map under low lamplight in that same European study. He studied it for nearly an hour, in silence, his fingertips hovering just above the parchment's surface, never quite touching. When he finally spoke, it was to say one thing: if this is real, then it changes everything. His interest alone was enough to bring others into the fold, a small network of archaeologists, epigraphers, and one cautious geologist who had worked with him before. They did not announce their plans. They did not submit proposals for grants. The funding appeared quietly, funneled through a private trust whose name never reached the dig's paperwork. Before they set foot in the desert, the map underwent a battery of tests. The parchment was made from an animal hide, a species no longer native to Europe, suggesting it had traveled far before arriving in its final home. The ink contained trace elements of copper and arsenic, compounds known to certain ancient dye-making cultures in Mesopotamia, but rare in Egyptian practice, and the star coordinate system. It matched the sky's alignment from roughly 4200 BCE, centuries before Egypt's first recognized pharaoh, Nama, is believed to have ruled. Even with this, skepticism remained. Maps can be forged, coordinates can be guessed, but the silver-haired man's insistence carried weight, and the small team committed themselves to one discrete journey. Their arrival in Cairo was uneventful by design. They moved through the city like any other academic group, papers in order, equipment listed generically as survey tools, and no mention of the true goal on any customs form. They traveled west into the desert with 2 local guides, men whose fathers and grandfathers had led countless caravans into these same sands, though never to this specific patch of nothingness. The journey took 2 days by truck and foot. The last stretch was done under a pale, waning moon, the dunes lit in soft silver, their crests sharp as knives. The guides murmured that the place felt empty in a strange way, not the natural emptiness of the open desert, but something quieter, heavier, as if sound itself avoided the place. When they finally reached the coordinates, there was nothing to greet them but wind and shadow. The sand here lay flat, as if pressed down by some great weight, centuries ago. No rocks broke the surface, no scrub grass clung to life, just a wide shallow depression, a shape the geologist quietly noted, looked unnaturally even. It was here, in the cold blue light of pre-dawn, that the silver-haired man took the map from its protective case, and held it up to the horizon. The lines once vague on the parchment seemed to match the shallow slopes around them. The long twisting mark that had once been mistaken for a river matched perfectly to the gentle arc of the basin's northern edge. And in the exact center, the spot the mapmaker had marked with a spiral and an eye lay under their feet. No one spoke for several minutes. The guide shifted uneasily, one rubbing his thumb over the string of beads around his wrist. Finally, one of them asked the question aloud: how could they have known this place if no one lived here? It was a question that would echo in the minds of the team long after they began digging. For if the map was genuine, then someone thousands of years before the known history of Egypt had not only found this place, they had known it well enough to mark it, to measure it by the stars, and to encode it in a way that would survive the ages. In that moment, the team realized they were not just chasing a rumor, they were following a voice that had called across millennia, inscribed on fragile parchment, leading them to a place where, by every law of history, nothing should exist. And yet, something waited here, something that had endured when all else around it had been swallowed by the desert. The first day of excavation began in the thin light of dawn, when the horizon was still painted in pale shades of rose and gold. The air was cool, almost gentle, the kind of morning that fools you into thinking the desert might be forgiving. But those who live here know the truth. This is the desert's calm breath before the furnace doors open. The team marked a square around the coordinates the map had indicated, driving in 4 thin metal stakes and tying them with string. The basin floor seemed stubbornly ordinary at first. The sand here was lighter than the surrounding dunes, the grains smaller, more finely ground, as though the wind had been sifting and resifting this exact spot for centuries. They began with shallow scraping, removing the top layer in slow, careful sweeps. The desert gives nothing quickly. Each inch of progress came with the hiss of sand sliding from the shovels, the muted clink when the metal edge caught against something harder beneath. The guides worked beside the archaeologists, their movements economical, the rhythm unbroken. By mid-morning, the heat had begun to climb. The air shimmered above the site, distorting the edges of the excavation like a mirage. Sweat gathered at brows, grit clung to damp skin. The soundscape of the dig settled into a pattern. The steady scrape of shovels, the shuffle of feet repositioning, the occasional murmur of instruction. It was nearly noon when the first anomaly appeared. A shovel struck something with a deep hollow resonance, a sound that didn't belong in the middle of a desert basin. The geologist knelt, brushing away the fine grains with the soft edge of his hand. A smooth, cold surface emerged, pale stone, cut and fitted so precisely that the seam between blocks was no thicker than a fingernail. This was not the weathered limestone of the Giza Plateau, nor the sandstone common in local quarries. It was harder, denser, and faintly metallic in its sheen. The silver-haired man crouched beside it, running his fingers over the surface. The stone felt almost alive with coolness, as though it had never known the sun. Excavation slowed after that. Each layer of sand revealed more of the structure, an edge here, a carved groove there, until the top of a perfectly squared platform was exposed. The corners were oriented with uncanny precision to the cardinal directions, each one aligned to within a fraction of a degree. Then came the carvings. Faint at first, then sharper as the stone was cleaned. They were unlike anything the Egyptologists on site had seen. No hieroglyphs, no pictorial narrative, but instead a language of pure geometry, spirals within spirals, overlapping triangles, sequences of lines intersecting at angles that seemed to follow some unknown mathematical law. One of the younger archaeologists compared them to patterns found in early Mesopotamian cylinder seals, but the similarity was imperfect, like hearing a familiar song played in a key you've never known. The silver-haired man said nothing, but the others noticed how he lingered over one symbol in particular, a circle bisected by a vertical line with a star etched above it. As the platform's edges emerged, so too did the outline of a recessed entrance. It was sealed with a massive slab, its face covered in more of the strange carvings. There was no visible handle, no hinges, only a shallow groove along its perimeter, where the slab met the surrounding stone. The heat by now was oppressive, pressing down from above and radiating from below. The guides shifted uneasily, muttering in low voices. One refused to work directly in front of the sealed entrance, preferring instead to move sand from the edges. When asked why, he only said, "It feels wrong here." The afternoon passed in the slow ritual of dusting, scraping, measuring. Every so often, a gust of wind would sweep across the site, lifting a veil of sand into the air and coating the workers in fine grit. The sound of the wind seemed louder near the entrance, not a high whistle, but a low, almost vocal moan, as if the slab itself were humming. As evening approached, the sun's light turned deep amber, throwing long shadows across the basin. The temperature began to drop, and the desert shifted from one kind of danger to another. The team decided to halt for the night before attempting to move the slab. But before they could leave, the silver-haired man insisted on one last measurement. He placed his palm against the carvings on the slab, tracing the lines slowly. Then he pressed his ear to the stone. No one spoke while he listened. When he finally stepped back, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "There is space behind this, and it is hollow, far larger than I expected." The others felt it too, the knowledge that they stood at the threshold of something untouched for thousands of years, something that had waited, sealed in darkness, while dynasties rose and fell, while sands buried and uncovered the bones of empires. The camp that night was quiet, lanterns flickered in the wind, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, as if a storm were building somewhere beyond the horizon. The team spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. Sleep came slowly. Some dreamed of corridors spiraling downward into the earth, others of eyes watching from the darkness behind the slab. The morning air was sharp and cool, a thin veil of mist rising where the night's cold touched the warmer earth. In the pale light, the slab at the center of the basin looked different, less like a barrier, more like a lid. The carvings along its surface seemed to shift in subtle ways as the sun climbed, their shadows deepening, as if the designs themselves had been intended to awaken with the day. The team gathered without hurry. This was not a moment to be rushed. The silver-haired man gave a few soft-spoken instructions, and the work began. Steel wedges tapped gently into the seam where the slab met the platform, each blow deliberate, the sound resonating in the hollow space below. The stone resisted at first, as though reluctant to yield after centuries of stillness, but then, with a sound like the slow release of breath, it began to shift. The first gap was small, enough for a ribbon of cold air to curl upward. It carried with it a scent that no one could quite place, dry, yes, but not dusty. faintly metallic, and strangely sweet. The guides exchanged uneasy glances. When the slab was finally moved aside, what lay beyond was not darkness, but a muted golden glow. The entrance descended immediately into a narrow corridor, its walls sheened with a mineral finish that reflected the lantern light in soft halos. The air inside was unnaturally still, neither stale nor fresh, as if it existed outside the usual passage of time. Stepping into the corridor was like crossing into another world. The floor was perfectly level, the walls seamless, as though each had been carved from a single massive block, but it was the design that defied explanation. Along the walls ran two distinct layers of artistry. The upper register bore reliefs in a style vaguely reminiscent of early Egyptian tombs, figures in profile, arms extended, animals, stylized plants. Yet the proportions were subtly wrong. The torsos elongated, the hands too large, the eyes slightly off-center. These were not the careful, idealized forms of the Old Kingdom, but something older, raw, or perhaps borrowed from another culture entirely. Beneath this layer ran a second band of imagery, and here the Egyptian influence vanished completely. Geometric designs spiraled across the stone, intersecting with precise mathematical repetition, hexagons within circles, interlocking triangles, repeating arcs. The patterns felt almost like diagrams, as if they served a purpose beyond decoration. The archaeologists paused frequently, sketching, photographing, tracing. The younger members of the team whispered comparisons to Indus Valley seals, to Anatolian stonework, to patterns found in the megalithic sites of Malta. None of these were supposed to be here, together, in the same place, in a structure buried deep in the Egyptian desert. The corridor led downward at a gradual slope, its walls punctuated every few meters by small alcoves. In each, a carved figure knelt, hands cupped together. Some figures were unmistakably human, though depicted in unfamiliar headdresses. Others were more ambiguous, their proportions too long in the limb, their faces hidden by masks. The cupped hands of these statues were empty, but their posture suggested they once held something: offerings, lamps, perhaps sacred objects now lost to time. Halfway down the corridor, the team encountered a threshold unlike anything before it, a single arch of black stone that shimmered faintly in the lantern light, like obsidian dusted with frost. The geologist frowned. The stone was not native to Egypt, nor to any of the surrounding regions. How it had been brought here was as puzzling as why it had been used at all. Beyond the arch, the air grew colder, the slope ended, and the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Even prepared for strangeness, the team was unready for what they saw. The chamber's proportions were perfect squares, not rectangles as in most known tombs, and its ceiling was a shallow dome painted in a deep night sky blue. Across it stretched a map of the heavens, rendered in gold leaf, with constellations both familiar and unfamiliar. Some matched the known Egyptian star patterns, others matched no known ancient system at all, as if drawn from a sky over a world that never existed. At the center of the room stood a raised platform, its edges carved with the spiral eye symbol seen outside. Upon it rested a rectangular sarcophagus of dark polished stone. Its surface was smooth, except for a single deeply incised line running lengthwise across its lid, a line that, when traced, followed the path of the Milky Way as it appeared in the painted ceiling above. The archaeologists worked in near silence, their voices hushed, as if in a place of worship. The silver-haired man moved slowly around the platform, stopping occasionally to look up at the dome, then back down at the sarcophagus, as though comparing the two. What struck everyone, even in those first moments, was how little of the tomb felt Egyptian in the traditional sense. The precision of the geometry, the choice of materials, the mathematical symmetries, all of it pointed to a culture that valued measurement and alignment as much as ritual and myth. Yet scattered among these alien elements were familiar touches: the lotus flower carved into a corner stone, the falcon motif above the archway, the faint echo of the pharaonic crown in one of the wall reliefs. It was as if the tomb had been designed by a hand that knew Egypt but belonged elsewhere, someone who had lived in the overlap between two worlds. Before anyone approached the sarcophagus, the silver-haired man called for a halt. He stood in the center of the room, lantern held low, and said quietly, "This place is older than Egypt, older than anything we can date here, but someone at some point made it Egyptian enough to hide in plain sight." The statement hung in the air like a riddle, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The team began their preliminary survey, photographing the murals, measuring the angles of the chamber, sketching the star chart on the ceiling. One of the younger archaeologists noticed something curious, a small narrow slit running from the sarcophagus platform to the base of the wall, like a channel. Its purpose was unclear, but its precision was remarkable, perfectly straight for over 6 meters. By the time they emerged from the tomb that evening, the sun had already dipped low, the basin bathed in copper light. The slab was replaced, not fully sealed, but closed enough to keep the chamber protected. No one spoke much on the walk back to camp. The silver-haired man, though, lingered behind. Standing before the sealed entrance, he looked at the spiral eye carving one last time before following the others. Later, as the desert night fell silent again, he would write in his small leather-bound notebook. The morning after their first descent into the chamber, the camp moved slowly. No one spoke much over breakfast. The air had the strange, charged stillness that sometimes comes before a sandstorm, though the sky was clear and pale. Every member of the team seemed to sense that today they would cross an invisible threshold, not just into the heart of the tomb, but into something far less tangible, a chapter of history no one had known to look for. By mid-morning, the slab was pushed aside again, and the lanterns were lit for the cool descent. The chamber looked unchanged from the night before, the gold constellations still gleaming softly overhead, the sarcophagus, a silent presence in the center. Yet the stillness inside seemed heavier now, as if the room itself were aware of their intentions. It took nearly an hour to prepare for the opening. Instruments were checked, cameras positioned, and samples taken from the surface of the lid. The silver-haired man walked slowly around the sarcophagus, tracing its outline, his fingertips hovering just above the stone. Finally, with measured effort, they slid the heavy lid aside. The air that escaped was colder than the chamber itself, touching their faces like the breath of a long-forgotten winter. Inside lay a human figure, but not like any they had expected. The body was wrapped in layers of linen, though the weave was tighter and more uniform than typical Egyptian mummification. Across the chest rested a pectoral of beaten gold, set with inlays of lapis and carnelian, but in a design no one recognized, a central disc flanked not by falcons or scarabs, but by 2 stylized spirals echoing the symbols carved on the outer slab. The head was adorned with a crown, not the familiar double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, but a single circlet of hammered bronze, its edge engraved with geometric patterns. Most unsettling of all were the eyes. Where the linen had been carefully cut away from the face, polished black stones had been set into the sockets, smooth, flawless, and faintly reflective, so that in the lantern light they seemed almost wet, almost alive. The archaeologists leaned in, each instinctively lowering their voices, as though they stood in the presence of someone who might awaken. The facial features beneath the wrappings were fine and narrow, the jawline long, the nose aquiline, traits not common in the pharaonic remains they had studied before. Within hours, the team began the careful process of sampling. Small fragments of bone and tissue were removed for testing, sealed immediately in sterile containers. The pectoral was photographed and sketched but left in place, its symbolism too unclear to risk disturbing without further study. In the following days, the results began to return from the portable lab equipment in the camp. The initial radiocarbon dating shocked even the most cautious among them. The remains were at least 1,500 years older than Nama's unification of Egypt, older than the first dynasty itself. The genetic analysis was even more startling. While portions of the DNA matched known ancient Nile Valley populations, others pointed far afield toward the Caucasus region, and faint traces suggestive of early Anatolian ancestry. This was not a native Egyptian ruler, at least not by bloodline. The implications were staggering. If the dating was accurate, this individual had lived before Egypt as we know it existed, and yet here he lay in a tomb bearing both foreign and Egyptian elements, entombed with regalia that implied sovereignty over a land that had not yet been born. The silver-haired man sat in the chamber for hours that day, speaking little. Once when one of the younger archaeologists asked whether the man in the sarcophagus was truly a pharaoh, he answered slowly, "He was something. Perhaps pharaoh is the closest word we have, but no, he is not in our lists, because our lists were written after someone decided what was worth remembering." This idea of deliberate erasure became the undercurrent of every conversation in the camp. History, they reminded themselves, is not simply what happened, it is what survives in record, and what is recorded is often a choice. As they examined the chamber further, they found more evidence that this ruler's existence had been intentionally obscured. The reliefs on the upper walls, those that carried the most Egyptian influence, had sections that were smoothed over, their figures scraped away. In their place were faint geometric etchings, as if the original scenes had been replaced with something more symbolic, more abstract. The burial goods were equally confounding. Instead of the usual amulets, shabtu figures, and canopic jars, the chamber held objects of unusual purpose: copper instruments with curved razor-thin edges, small stone spheres of identical size and weight, a set of gold rods etched with markings that did not match any known script. One object, carved from an iridescent black stone, was shaped like a teardrop and warm to the touch, even in the cool air of the tomb. The guides refused to linger near these items. One claimed in a whisper that the black teardrop watched anyone who came too close. The scientists dismissed this as superstition, but still, none of them touched it without gloves. That night, around the campfire, the conversation turned to politics. If this man had been a ruler, and the evidence pointed strongly to that, why was he erased? One theory suggested that he had been an outsider who seized power only to be removed and struck from history when native dynasties reclaimed the throne. Another proposed that he had been a leader during a forgotten cataclysm, one so devastating that his reign became synonymous with misfortune, prompting later generations to bury all memory of him. But the silver-haired man offered a third possibility. His voice was low, his gaze fixed on the firelight. "Sometimes," he said, "the past is not erased because it is shameful, but because it is too dangerous. Not dangerous to pride, dangerous to knowledge itself." If this man's life, or what he ruled, revealed something the world was not meant to keep, then erasure was the only protection. The desert wind picked up then, scattering the fire's embers into the dark. In the distance, the dunes shifted under the moonlight, their shapes imperceptibly changing. The team sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing as heavily as the sand above the tomb. The pharaoh, who never was, a ruler whose reign was measured not in the scrolls of history, but in the shadows between them. His crown, his regalia, his resting place, all spoke of authority, and yet not a single monument, stela, or inscription in the known world bore his name. Only here, deep in an impossible tomb, did his existence survive. And even here it was wrapped in layers of symbols, secrets, and silences. Tomorrow, they would begin cataloguing the rest of the artifacts. But tonight, each member of the team lay awake longer than usual, the image of those black stone eyes returning unbidden in the quiet moments before sleep. The work of cataloguing began at sunrise, though the team's movements were slower now, their hands more deliberate. They had already seen enough to know that every object in this tomb would defy the neat boxes in which history prefers to place its finds. The challenge was no longer simply to record them, it was to decide how or if they could even be explained. The burial chamber was not cluttered in the way of later Egyptian tombs. There were no crowded shelves of shabti figurines, no piles of pottery or food offerings. Instead, the items were arranged with a precision that mirrored the geometry carved into the walls. Each rested on its own low stone plinth, spaced evenly apart, as though each object carried its own quiet gravity. The first to draw attention was a set of tools. Not the copper chisels or bronze blades familiar to early metallurgy, but something far stranger, slender rods of an alloy, so pale it seemed almost white. They were light in weight, but harder than any of them expected, resisting even the steel of a modern test blade. Along their length, tiny etched symbols marched in perfect alignment, some resembling early proto-writing, others so abstract they seemed more like mathematical notation. Beside them lay a series of scrolls, rolled and bound with thin strips of gold. When unrolled, with extreme care, the material proved not to be papyrus, but something smoother, fibrous yet almost translucent, like pressed silk. The writing on them was baffling, columns of text in a language that borrowed characters from at least 3 ancient systems, yet belonged to none of them entirely. Interspersed between the lines were diagrams, astronomical charts, geometric patterns, and once, the outline of a landmass that did not match any known coastline. It was the star chart that unsettled the team the most. Rendered with meticulous precision, it depicted the night sky not as it appears now, but as it would have looked roughly 10,000 years ago, based on precession of the equinoxes. This was far older than the accepted beginning of Egyptian civilization, so old in fact that the Sahara itself would have been a green fertile plain. The geologist kept returning to the same question: how could a culture 6,000 years before the pyramids have recorded the stars with such accuracy? And perhaps more troubling, why was this chart buried here with a ruler whose very existence had been erased? Near the far wall, they found a group of objects that none of them could name, small spheres of stone, each the size of a clenched fist, perfectly smooth, and identical in weight to within a fraction of a gram. They were arranged in a triangle of 9, and when moved, produced a faint ringing tone, not from striking each other, but from within, as if hollow. Attempts to see inside them were postponed, their construction was too perfect to risk damaging without full study. The most inexplicable artifact was set apart on a pedestal of darker stone, carved from a single piece of black crystal. It was shaped like a teardrop, its surface so polished it reflected faces like a mirror, yet it was not cold, as stone should be in the chilled air of the tomb. Instead, it held a faint warmth, like something that had been touched by sunlight only moments ago. The guides avoided it completely. One muttered a single word in Arabic, Ain A, and would not elaborate. The silver-haired man, however, examined it for nearly 20 minutes. He never touched it directly but walked around it in silence, studying the way the chamber's lantern light seemed to bend subtly across its surface. Among the burial goods was also an oddly modern-looking object, a disc of metal, the width of a hand, with concentric grooves etched into its face. The grooves were too fine for any obvious decorative purpose, and when light struck them at the right angle, faint symbols appeared, as if the metal were remembering something. One of the archaeologists likened it to a record, not for sound, perhaps, but for something else entirely. Piece by piece, the tomb's inventory grew stranger. Each object seemed to carry a dual nature, one foot in the known, one in the unknown. The tools were functional, yet alien, the scrolls part familiar language and part indecipherable code, the star chart accurate yet impossibly ancient. And all of it, every last piece, had been buried with a ruler absent from the historical record. The silver-haired man began sketching connections in his notebook, linking the geometry of the chamber to the layout of the objects, linking the star chart to the black crystal teardrop, linking the strange alloy tools to the foreign bloodline revealed by DNA. He did not share his full theory, but one evening by the fire he said softly to the geologist, "These were not simply possessions, they were instructions." The idea lingered. If these items were meant as instructions, to whom were they addressed? To the dead ruler himself, for some journey beyond life, to the living in some future age, when the tomb would be rediscovered, or perhaps to a people yet to come, who might understand what the artifacts meant in ways the present could not. One more object was found late in the cataloguing, a narrow rectangular panel of stone, tucked flat against the wall behind the sarcophagus. It bore no images, no text, only a single deep groove running from one corner to the other. Yet when light from a lantern was passed across it, a faint image emerged, as though hidden in the stone's grain, the outline of a solar eclipse, and beneath it, a procession of figures crossing a land bridged by what appeared to be water. The geologist's voice was quiet when she spoke. "This is not just burial art. This is a memory." By the end of that day, the team realized they were no longer looking at a collection of burial goods, but at a library of objects, each speaking in a language they only half understood, a message from a time before history, entrusted to a man who was not supposed to exist, in a tomb that should never have been found. Outside, the wind swept low across the basin, carrying with it the smell of distant rain. The desert, it seemed, was listening. Every civilization carries its silences. Some are accidental, the result of erosion, decay, or the slow grinding of centuries. But others are deliberate, the kind of silence that begins as an act of will. Historians often call these gaps in the record, but in truth, they are more like missing bones in a skeleton. The shape of the body changes when they are gone. Egypt is no exception. For all its grandeur and record-keeping, for all the names etched into stone and the lists of kings preserved for millennia, there are vast stretches of its past, where the details fade into shadow. Between the fading echoes of the Neolithic communities along the Nile and the monumental clarity of the First Dynasty, there lies a murky frontier, a time before pharaohs, before pyramids, before even the idea of Egypt existed. It is into that silence that this tomb seems to speak. The artifacts recovered so far fit nowhere in the neat sequence of Egypt's known history. The genetic lineage of the ruler stretches beyond the Nile Valley, linking instead to distant regions. The star charts belong to a sky far older than Egypt itself. The tools are crafted from alloys unknown to early metallurgy. Each clue points backward into a time when the Sahara was not a desert, but a lush green corridor, a place where rivers ran and plains bloomed, where people might have built kingdoms now buried not by sand alone, but by time itself. The silver-haired man began to sketch an outline of what such a kingdom might have been. It would have stood at the intersection of cultures, a place where traders, travelers, and migrants from distant lands could meet. The Nile, not yet the narrow green ribbon we know today, would have been a broad, unpredictable force, flooding wide floodplains that sustained sprawling settlements, and beyond those, to the west, vast savannas stretched into what is now an unbroken desert. If the DNA was correct, the ruler in the tomb may have been the heir of a union between the Nile's early inhabitants and an incoming people from the north and east. Such unions could create powerful dynasties that might rule for centuries, then vanish in the upheaval of climate, war, or catastrophe. And here was the uncomfortable truth archaeology already knew of settlements from this green Sahara period: stone circles, early ceremonial sites, fragments of structures had been found far from the Nile, their purposes unclear. But they were scattered, fragmentary, and none had hinted at a centralized authority on the scale implied by this tomb. The more the team considered it, the more they realized that this was not just a burial site. It was evidence that the forgotten kingdom had not only existed, but had reached an advanced stage of cultural and scientific development. The artifacts suggested organized astronomy, precise metallurgy, and far-reaching trade, achievements that could rewrite the origin story of Egyptian civilization. And yet, why was there no trace in Egypt's later records? Why no stories, no legends, no half-remembered kings in the lists inscribed in temples? The silver-haired man offered a quiet answer one evening, as the wind swept fine sand over the camp. If you want to build a new order, you don't honor the old one, you bury it. And sometimes, you bury it so well that no one believes it ever existed. The idea unsettled the younger archaeologists. It meant that history was not merely incomplete, it was in some places intentionally engineered. This tomb, then, was not simply a survivor from an earlier time, it was a breach in that engineering, a flaw in the design of forgetting. As days passed, the team began tracing the tomb's architectural cues against other sites. The geometric carvings bore resemblance to patterns at Nabta Playa, an ancient ceremonial site deep in the Nubian desert, where stone alignments mark solstices and star risings. The astronomical ceiling recalled not only Egyptian temples, but also megalithic sites thousands of miles away. And the polished black crystal teardrop had no precedent at all. It stood alone, as if it had been created in isolation, or for a purpose so specialized, it left no other traces in the archaeological record. The most haunting connection came from the star chart itself. Its constellations matched not the sky above Egypt, but the sky as it would have appeared from a latitude hundreds of miles to the north, perhaps from the very lands where the ruler's ancestors had come. This raised a possibility that kept the team awake at night. Was this tomb built here because this ruler died here, or was it built here because something from his homeland had to be hidden in the deep desert? Outside the basin, the landscape stretched in waves of gold and red, endless and unbroken. But the guides spoke quietly of other places, basins where the sand was different, where wind uncovered the tips of standing stones after certain storms, where fragments of pottery were scattered far from any water source. These, they suggested, might be other remnants of the forgotten kingdom, buried deeper than this one. It was a thought that made the desert seem less empty and far more dangerous. By the time the team concluded their preliminary analysis, one truth had become clear: if the tomb's occupant had been part of such a kingdom, his people had not simply vanished into the sands, their legacy had been cut from history with surgical precision. What remained was only this: a single impossible tomb standing like an island in the ocean of time. In ancient Egypt, immortality was not just a matter of belief, it was a matter of inscription. To have one's name carved in stone, repeated in temple walls, spoken in rituals, was to ensure that the self endured beyond death. And to remove that name, to chisel it away until only bare stone remained, was to condemn the soul to a second final death, the death of memory. This practice was not rare. Pharaohs who fell out of favor, who were overthrown, or whose reigns were deemed shameful often suffered damnatio memoriae, the systematic destruction of their legacy. Hatshepsut's statues were defaced, Akhenaten's name was struck from records, and dozens of lesser-known rulers simply vanished from the official king lists. But even in erasure, traces remain: broken cartouches, half-scraped reliefs, whispered references in later texts. The ruler in the Basin tomb was different. Here, there was not the fractured shadow of a name, there was nothing at all: no cartouche, no inscribed royal titulary, no dedicatory text identifying the occupant. In the outer corridor, where Egyptian tradition would usually place prayers or declarations of the king's greatness, there were only the spirals, the geometry, and the foreign motifs. It was as though this man had been stripped from history, not after his reign, but before it could be written. In the days following the genetic analysis, the team began searching the tomb for even the smallest hint of a name, a hidden inscription inside an alcove, a seal on a piece of binding linen, a mark beneath the sarcophagus lid. Nothing emerged. The absence was total, deliberate. The silver-haired man considered this in silence. Then, one afternoon, he spoke quietly to the youngest archaeologist on the team. To erase a king from memory, you must first acknowledge he existed, but to erase him entirely, you must prevent the record from ever being made. That means control, absolute control, over who writes the history. If this was true, then the ruler in the tomb had not merely been removed from Egypt's annals, he had been buried during a time when the power to define history lay in the hands of those who wished him forgotten. And if his tomb was built in secrecy, outside the Nile's main centers, it might explain why no trace of his name had ever appeared. The team began reviewing known examples of early erasure, and patterns emerged. In each case, the destruction of a ruler's name was accompanied by the appropriation of their monuments, the recarving of their images, the repurposing of their symbols. The same might have happened here, but on a scale so complete that the king lists began without him, as though his reign had been cut away from the foundation itself. One wall in the burial chamber hinted at this process. The upper register contained faint depressions, shapes that might once have been figures. Under raking light, the outlines of 3 seated figures appeared, their faces scraped away and replaced with geometric patterns. No one could say whether these had been images of the ruler himself or of deities connected to him. But the deliberate overwriting was unmistakable. The most chilling discovery came from the crown found upon the mummy's head. Beneath the bronze circlet, the linen wrappings bore faint traces of red pigment. When examined under magnification, these traces formed the ghost of a symbol, perhaps a personal seal or emblem, but one that had been painted over with a thin, nearly invisible layer of gold leaf before burial. Someone had hidden his identity, even in death, concealing it beneath the very regalia that marked his authority. Why? Theories shifted daily. Some thought he was an outsider who briefly ruled and was later replaced by native kings. Others suspected he represented an entire dynasty erased in the aftermath of a civil war. The silver-haired man proposed a darker idea. Perhaps his reign revealed something that those who came after could not allow to survive. Knowledge can be more dangerous than power, and it can outlive it, if you let it. The thought settled over the camp, like a second shadow. The team realized that whatever truth this ruler embodied, whatever his kingdom had been, it had been buried under not just sand but silence. And that silence had lasted for thousands of years, broken only now by accident, or perhaps by inevitability. That night, the wind rose, sweeping the basin clean of their footprints. By morning the tomb entrance looked as though no human had stood there in centuries. The desert had begun its quiet work of covering the name that had already been erased. The results came in on the 3rd evening, after the body was unwrapped. They had been expected, but expectation did little to soften their impact. Around the folding table, in the largest tent, the team leaned over the laptop's glow, as the genetic report scrolled into view. The mitochondrial DNA was unmistakable. It matched lineages known in the Nile Valley's earliest inhabitants, the people who had lived along the river, long before the first monumental stone was cut. But the paternal markers told another story. They traced outward, far beyond Egypt's borders, into the highlands of the Caucasus and the plateaus of early Anatolia. It was a genetic fingerprint that spoke of movement, migration, and mingling over vast distances. In the narrow world of early dynastic politics, such bloodlines could be both a strength and a danger. To rule Egypt was to be of Egypt, or at least to present oneself that way. Foreign origins could undermine legitimacy, especially in an era when the idea of divine kingship was still forming. When a ruler's right to the throne rested as much on myth as on muscle, the silver-haired man spoke first. His voice was low, but it carried through the tent. He was not entirely of this land, and in a kingdom that was still learning to see itself, that could not be tolerated. The younger archaeologists debated the possibilities. Perhaps he had been a conqueror, arriving with warriors from the north, seizing the fertile floodplains before being overthrown. Or perhaps he had been a diplomat's son, rising to power through alliances, only to be cast out when those alliances shifted. Another theory was that he had inherited his foreign bloodline through centuries of intermarriage, but had ruled so successfully that his ancestry mattered only after his death, when new rulers sought to paint him as an outsider to justify their own claim. Whatever the truth, the artifacts in his tomb suggested more than a fleeting presence. The tools, the star charts, the geometric designs, all hinted at a culture as advanced as, and in some ways different from, the emerging Nile civilizations. If he was foreign, he had brought with him knowledge that did not originate here. That knowledge may have been his undoing. In ancient Egypt, foreign influence was a paradox. On one hand, Egypt was a crossroads, its traders and armies moving along routes that reached deep into Africa, across the Levant, and into the Mediterranean. Goods and ideas flowed in both directions, but political power, the right to rule, was jealously guarded. Even later pharaohs, who married foreign princesses, often kept them at the periphery of public life. Outsiders might be welcome at court, but they were rarely allowed to be the court, and so the team began to see a possible motive for the erasure. If this ruler's ancestry was not purely Egyptian, then eliminating him from history might have been as much about preserving a narrative of unity and divine legitimacy as about burying a personal rival. The first dynasty and its successors built Egypt's identity on the image of a seamless, unbroken native kingship. A king with northern blood, no matter his achievements, would have disrupted that story. The silver-haired man spent the next morning studying the murals again. He noted details that had been overlooked before: a recurring figure wearing a tunic unlike any seen in early Egyptian art, a depiction of ships with high curling prows, more common to the Mediterranean than the Nile. Even the animals carved into the reliefs, certain long-horned cattle, a type of hound with a narrow muzzle, matched species depicted in Anatolian rock art, not the familiar iconography of the Nile Valley. In the far corner of the chamber, an alcove held a small carved box of cedar. Inside was a fragment of cloth, unlike the linen wrappings, thicker, coarser, dyed a deep reddish brown. Testing confirmed that the dye was made from madder root, a plant common in the Caucasus, but rare in early Egypt. This perhaps had been the ruler's cloak, preserved not as regalia, but as a token of origin. The find carried a quiet weight. It was a reminder that for all the grandeur of ancient Egypt, its earliest centuries were shaped by movements of people from far beyond its borders. The Nile drew them in like a magnet, offering water, fertile soil, and a chance at permanence in a shifting world. Some came as traders, some as settlers, some as conquerors, and some perhaps as kings. If this man had indeed ruled, his reign would have been a fusion, a kingdom born of the Nile, but carrying the memory of other skies and other lands. Such a fusion could have accelerated Egypt's rise, or threatened its unity. In either case, when the time came to write the official story, there was no place for him. That evening, as the camp settled into its nightly rhythm, the silver-haired man sat outside his tent, watching the last light drain from the horizon. The desert was quiet, except for the low sigh of wind over the dunes. He spoke without looking away from the darkening sky. Foreign blood in a sacred land. History tells us that Egypt feared it, but perhaps it feared the power it carried even more. The words lingered in the air. Around him, the team members found themselves imagining what it must have been like to be a ruler standing between worlds, wearing the crown of Egypt, while carrying the memory of mountains and seas far to the north. In the deep hours of the night, the wind shifted. It carried with it the faintest scent of something green, like waterweed or rain on distant grass. One of the guides stirred in his sleep, muttering in a language none of the archaeologists understood. Later, when asked, he would only say that he had dreamed of rivers running through the desert, rivers that flowed toward the tomb, as if answering a call across thousands of years. From the moment the team first stepped into the burial chamber, their eyes had been drawn upward to the painted dome, a deep, unbroken blue, across which constellations gleamed in thin lines of gold leaf. At first glance, it was easy to mistake it for the familiar star maps seen in later Egyptian temples, where Nut, goddess of the sky, arched overhead in protective embrace. But this dome carried no goddess, no figures, no divine narrative. It was pure astronomy. The stars were placed with meticulous precision. Orion stood near the center, his belt rendered as 3 sharp points of gold, the hunter's outline subtly different from modern depictions. To the south, the familiar curves of the Milky Way arched across the sky, but here its position was wrong. Not by accident, but by design. It was the geologist who first noticed the shift. She had studied enough archaeoastronomy to recognize the effects of axial precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotation that causes the stars' positions to change over millennia. By her calculations, the constellations on the dome matched their positions not in the age of the pharaohs, nor in the centuries before them, but in a sky last seen around 8000 BCE. That date was older than the pyramids, older than the first hieroglyphs, older even than the unification of Egypt. It placed the map in a time when the Sahara was still a fertile land of rivers and lakes, and when no known Egyptian civilization yet existed. The silence in the chamber that day was heavy. Each person understood the implication. Whoever had designed this tomb had knowledge of the stars, as they were more than 10,000 years ago, knowledge that according to mainstream history, no culture in this region should have possessed. The link to the parchment map that had led them here was immediate. The coordinates inked on its surface had been calculated from the stars, and those calculations were only possible with an intimate understanding of the sky from that same deep past. The team turned next to the star chart, found among the burial artifacts. It was more detailed than the dome, etched onto a sheet of that strange silk-like material. The constellations were drawn in crisp, thin ink, each labeled in a hybrid script no one could yet fully decipher. Between them were faint lines, not random, but deliberate connections, forming a network of triangles and arcs. One section of the chart drew particular interest, an alignment between 3 stars in Orion's belt, and a 4th point positioned far from them on the page. When this 4th point was traced back to the dome above, it corresponded to a star no longer visible from Egypt's latitude, a star that would have been prominent in the sky only before a cataclysmic shift in the Earth's climate around the end of the last ice age. The silver-haired man studied the diagram for hours. When he finally spoke, his tone was more measured than excited. This is not a map for navigation in the ordinary sense. It's a message, a memory of a sky that no longer exists. But why? Why would a ruler erased from history, buried in a tomb outside the Nile's great centers, choose to carry into death a record of the heavens from a time so distant? Theories unfolded slowly, as though the desert itself resisted quick answers. One suggestion was that the star map marked a sacred alignment, a moment when certain stars reached positions of ritual significance. Another proposed that it was a calendar, not for harvests or festivals, but for events measured in thousands of years. Then there was the most unsettling possibility, that the map was a record of a time before a catastrophe, a way to mark before and after in the great cycle of the world. Ancient traditions from across the globe speak of floods, of fires, of skies that darkened or shifted. Could the ruler in the tomb have been preserving a memory, not just for his own people, but for anyone who might come after? The geometry etched into the tomb's walls seemed to support this idea. When overlaid onto the star map, certain spirals matched the paths of processional movement, as if the tomb itself was a kind of 3-dimensional diagram of the shifting heavens. The narrow groove running from the sarcophagus to the wall, once thought decorative, now appeared to align with a specific point on the horizon, where a bright star would have risen in that ancient sky. The silver-haired man sketched it in his notebook, then closed the book without showing anyone. His expression was thoughtful, but also guarded. As night fell that day, the team gathered outside the tomb to watch the actual stars above. The desert sky was clear, sharp, with cold. Over their heads, Orion's belt glimmered in the darkness, the same 3 stars that had been marked in gold on the tomb's ceiling. But here now, they stood at a slightly different angle than in the painted dome. It was a quiet reminder that the heavens were not fixed. They moved slowly, but inexorably, across human time. The guides sat apart from the archaeologists, speaking softly in their own language. One of them, an older man with weathered hands, eventually walked over and looked toward the constellation. In Arabic, he said only, "These stars, they were once in another place. My grandfather told me." But that was before the sand came. The statement, simple as it was, settled over the group with a strange weight. Oral memory, passed down through generations, had preserved an echo of the very shift the scientists were now calculating from charts. Inside the burial chamber, The painted dome waited in silence, its golden stars locked forever in a sky from the deep past. The message it carried was not written in words but in the slow dance of the universe, a language so vast and patient that only those willing to look across thousands of years could begin to read it, and now, someone had read enough to bring them here. The question was whether the tomb's ruler had intended the message for the living or for someone or something else entirely. It was the younger of the two guides who first pointed it out. On the second day, inside the burial chamber, as the team catalogued the artifacts, he lingered near the entrance arch, the one made from the shimmering black stone, and ran his fingers along a faint groove just above eye level. Beneath a layer of dust, the groove revealed itself to be a line of small, sharply carved symbols. They were not hieroglyphs. At first glance, they seemed almost like a form of proto-writing angular marks, each composed of 3 or 4 precise strokes. The silver-haired man studied them with the same care he had given to the star chart, tracing each one with a gloved fingertip. When translated as best they could, piecing together phonetic guesses from related ancient scripts, the meaning was unsettling in its simplicity. Those who enter without the name will carry the name of death. The guides stepped back when the phrase was read aloud. One of them muttered a prayer under his breath. Even the archaeologists, trained to dismiss such warnings as ritual theatrics, fell quiet. In Egypt, tomb curses were rare but not unheard of. More often, inscriptions invoked protection from the gods or promised divine favor to those who respected the dead. This one, however, was different. It was not a plea, it was a sentence. From that moment, an unspoken tension crept into the camp. The first incident came 2 days later. A camera tripod, secured firmly in the corner of the chamber, collapsed without warning, shattering the lens it held. No one had touched it. The geologists suggested the legs had slipped on the smooth stone floor, but the guides exchanged uneasy glances. That night, a sandstorm rose without warning. The wind screamed across the basin, driving grit into every seam of the tents. Equipment had to be covered in haste, and by morning, half the trench they had dug around the tomb was filled in again. A day after that, one of the younger archaeologists fell ill. Fever, chills, a cough that seemed to sap his strength. He was evacuated to a nearby town for treatment. The doctors called it a lung infection, likely from breathing too much fine dust. But in the camp, whispers about the name of death grew louder. The silver-haired man refused to indulge them. The curse, he told the team one evening, over the low hiss of the camp stove, is the oldest form of psychological warfare. It does not need to be real to be effective. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the black stone arch as he spoke. Still, the incidents continued. A GPS unit stopped working entirely after being brought into the chamber, refusing to power on even after replacing the batteries. A sealed case of bottled water was found open one morning, each cap loosened as though by hand, though no one claimed to have touched it. The most unnerving event happened just after dusk, one evening, when 2 members of the team were in the tomb making measurements. Without warning, the lanterns dimmed, not extinguished, but reduced to a faint glow, as if a heavy fog had rolled in. The air felt suddenly colder, and in that thin light, one of the archaeologists swore she saw movement in the far alcove. A figure crouched low, hands cupped together just like the carved statues along the corridor. When the lanterns brightened again, the alcove was empty. She didn't return to the tomb after that. Whether coincidence, environmental factors, or something else entirely, the pattern was enough to affect the rhythm of the work. The guides refused to remain inside for more than an hour at a time. The archaeologists rotated shifts so no one was left alone, and yet, the warning carved above the arch lingered in everyone's mind, those who enter without the name. The phrase was especially troubling, given what they had already discovered, that the tomb's ruler had no surviving name, no inscription, no official place in history. If the curse's logic was to be believed, anyone who entered was, by definition, entering without the name. The silver-haired man, however, seemed almost invigorated by the tension. Late one night, he sat outside his tent with a lantern, carefully copying the warning inscription into his notebook. When asked what he thought it truly meant, he replied, "I think it's less a threat and more a test. If you enter without knowing who he was, truly knowing, then you are blind here, and blindness in this place is dangerous." He did not elaborate on what kind of danger he meant. By the end of that week, the team had adopted a ritual before stepping into the tomb. It began half-jokingly. Someone would pause at the black arch, place a hand over their heart, and speak aloud the title they had begun using in place of the missing name. The Pharaoh who never was. In time, they all began doing it. Even the skeptics. Whether it was superstition, respect, or simply the human need for patterns, it made entering feel less like trespass. Inside the chamber, the air remained still and cold, untouched by the desert's heat. The golden stars on the dome continued to shine faintly in the lantern light, indifferent to human fears, and somewhere in the unbroken silence of that place, the carved words above the arch waited for their next reader, ready to speak again in a voice older than the desert itself. The desert remembers in strange ways. It is not like the mountains, which hold their memories in unyielding stone, or the forests, where life replaces itself endlessly, weaving the past into new growth. The desert remembers, through absence, by what it does not allow to remain. Here, the wind is the archivist. It lifts the sand, grain by grain, moving it from one place to another, as though sifting through a library of fragments. A stone left exposed today may be hidden tomorrow, and revealed again in 100 years. The past is never truly gone here, but neither is it truly present. It drifts in and out of reach, like a voice carried on the edge of hearing. From the rim of the basin, the tomb is invisible. A few faint lines in the sand mark the excavation site, but beyond that, it is indistinguishable from the endless waves of gold stretching to the horizon. The sky above is so wide it almost erases scale. The eye struggles to believe that this much space can exist without interruption. And yet, somewhere beneath that calm, the tomb waits, a chamber of cold air and ancient symbols, sealed away for thousands of years. How many others lie hidden, their entrances buried under centuries of wind? How many stories lie in those sealed darkness, untold, because no one has yet found the right star, the right map, the right moment to dig? In the afternoons, when the work pauses and the heat is at its most punishing, the camp falls into a kind of suspended animation. The archaeologists retreat to the shade, the guides sit cross-legged in the lee of a dune, and the only sound is the low hiss of wind skimming over the sand. In those hours, it is easy to imagine that the basin itself is listening. The silver-haired man often walks the perimeter, then not speaking, just moving in long arcs until he stops at some place where the wind has piled the sand differently. Once he crouched and brushed away a thin layer with his palm, revealing a patch of stone that was not part of the tomb's visible structure. He said nothing about it, simply replaced the sand and moved on as though the knowledge of its presence was enough for now. The desert is a paradox. It erases, but it also preserves. A wooden artifact will rot in the damp air of a coastal city within decades, but here, linen from 5,000 years ago can be found almost intact. The dryness freezes time in place until the wind decides to let it go. In this way, the desert holds both the truth and the lie of history. It can keep a thing hidden until the world is ready for it, or until it forgets why it hid it in the first place. And when it finally gives up its secret, it does so without ceremony, as if to say, "Here, you may have this now, but only this." Standing at the edge of the basin at sunset, the view is stripped down to the essentials: sand, stone, sky. The light softens until the horizon blurs, and the heat radiating from the ground feels like the fading warmth of a fire long burned down. It is in this hour that the desert seems most alive, not in the way a forest teems with movement, but in the way an ocean breathes. Some nights, the wind carries with it the faint scent of something that should not be here, the sharp tang of water, or the sweet, dusty smell of long dry grass. It's gone as quickly as it comes, leaving behind the unsettling sense that the desert is remembering something it once was, and perhaps that is why the tomb feels so out of place, and yet so inevitable. It is not just a monument buried in sand, it is a conversation between the present and a past, so deep it resists measurement. The carvings, the geometry, the artifacts, all are voices in that conversation. And the desert, patient as ever, has kept them safe until now. But the desert is not sentimental, it will not guard them forever. One day, the wind will fill the basin again, covering the entrance, smoothing away the footprints, sealing the tomb beneath its shifting skin. And then the Pharaoh who never was, will return to silence his secrets, waiting for the next time the desert decides to speak. The first connection came, almost by accident. One of the younger archaeologists, cross-referencing the geometric wall carvings with known Egyptian motifs, stumbled instead onto something far from the Nile, the intricate, interlocking patterns carved into the massive T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. The resemblance was not exact, but close enough to be troubling. Spirals, nested within spirals, angular intersections that seemed to follow an underlying mathematical logic. Göbekli Tepe, dated to around 9500 BCE, thousands of years before Egypt's first pharaoh, and yet here in the burial chamber of a man erased from history, were echoes of its symbolic language. The silver-haired man said little at first, but in the evenings, he began unrolling maps across the mess table in the largest tent. These were not modern maps, but layered reproductions of ancient sites across the continents, their dates scrawled in pencil. He would trace lines between them, not roads or rivers, but paths defined by star alignments, shared iconography, or uncanny parallels in construction. In one column of his notes, he listed Göbekli Tepe, spiral and animal motifs, astronomical alignments, Mohenjo-daro, standardized weights and measures, mysterious undeciphered script, Nabta Playa, stone circles marking solstices, cattle cult imagery, Caral Supe, in Peru, monumental architecture, with no signs of warfare, emphasis on ceremonial plazas, Olmec Leventa, polished stone artifacts of unknown origin, depictions of rulers in hybrid dress. Each site was far removed in both geography and time, yet in the silver-haired man's arrangement, they seemed less like isolated peaks of civilization, and more like islands in a partially submerged continent, fragments of something larger. The artifacts in the tomb strengthened the pattern. The copper alloy rods bore etchings that, when compared side by side, shared uncanny similarities with symbols found on Indus Valley seals. The black crystal teardrop had no match in Egypt, but the Olmec heartland had produced polished obsidian mirrors of similar form, objects whose purpose remains debated to this day. The spheres of stone recalled those found in Costa Rica, perfect in shape, uniform in size, and arranged in deliberate patterns. None of these parallels could be proven as direct connections. The orthodox explanation would be coincidence, that human cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, naturally stumbled onto similar solutions and symbols. But the silver-haired man was not satisfied with coincidence. "We've been trained to see lines as walls," he told the team one night. "But sometimes a line is a thread." He pointed to the star map from the tomb, and traced its alignments, not just to the Egyptian sky, but to the latitudes of other ancient sites. Some constellations that sat low on the horizon in Egypt would have been directly overhead in Anatolia, or visible in a completely different seasonal pattern in Mesoamerica. The suggestion was audacious. The map might not be a guide for a single place, but a record of a sky observed from multiple points on the Earth's surface. If true, it implied travel, or at least shared knowledge, on a scale far beyond what is accepted for that era. The guides listened to these discussions with quiet interest, occasionally contributing their own fragments of oral history. One spoke of an old Bedouin tale, of a path of the kings that stretched farther than the horizon, linking lands of stone to lands of green, and green to lands of water. Another recalled a story from his grandmother, about the ships before ships, vessels that traveled not by oar or sail, but by riding the stars. The archaeologists smiled politely, but the silver-haired man only nodded, as though these were not tales but pieces. Inside the burial chamber, the walls seemed to hum with this broader context. The kneeling statues in the corridor, some with distinctly non-Egyptian headdresses, could now be seen as ambassadors from other lands, carved in the style of the ruler's homeland. The mural in the final chamber, showing a solar eclipse over a migration across a drowned land, took on new weight. Was this not simply a funerary image, but a record of the ruler's own journey, or the memory of his ancestors? One afternoon, while measuring the groove that ran from the sarcophagus to the wall, the geologist noticed it aligned perfectly with the midwinter solstice sunrise, an alignment mirrored at Nabta Playa, and several megalithic sites in Europe. This was not a random choice. Whoever built the tomb had embedded within it a language of light, geometry, and celestial timing, a language spoken in other places by other builders. The implication was clear. The pharaoh who never was might have ruled a kingdom that was not an isolated Nile power, but part of a network, a web of knowledge, trade, and ritual stretching across continents, a network that did not survive into recorded history, except in scattered echoes. Yet if such a network existed, it raised a troubling question: why had it vanished so completely? Civilizations fall, but traces endure. Here in the tomb were hints of deliberate burial of symbols, scraped away, of a name erased. Could the same force that erased this ruler have also erased the network he was part of? The silver-haired man's answer, when it came, was almost a whisper: a thread can be cut, but sometimes it is pulled until the whole tapestry unravels. The team left the chamber late that evening. Outside, the desert was unusually still, the sky a vast bowl of stars. Orion rose slowly in the east, his belt bright against the blackness, and for a moment it was possible to imagine those same 3 stars shining over Göbekli Tepe, over the Indus Valley, over the jungles of Mesoamerica, all at once, all connected, all part of a world that existed before history began to write its own boundaries. By now the team believed they had explored every part of the tomb. The central chamber had been measured, its artifacts catalogued, its walls documented in thousands of photographs. Yet the silver-haired man remained restless. He walked the chamber each morning and evening, as though tracing the lines of an unfinished puzzle. It was on one such morning that he stopped abruptly near the far wall, the one opposite the sarcophagus. There, beneath a panel of carvings depicting spirals and intersecting triangles, his hand found a shallow recess, no larger than a coin. The dust inside it was different, finer, lighter. He brushed it away, and the outline of a small square stone plug emerged. The discovery brought the entire team inside. Under careful hands, the plug was loosened. Behind it lay a narrow slot, deep enough to hide a locking mechanism. The silver-haired man suspected what it was, immediately: a seal. Not decorative, not symbolic, but functional, designed to keep something hidden from even those who could enter the tomb. It took most of the day to free the mechanism. When it finally clicked, the panel above it shifted almost imperceptibly. With the help of ropes and wedges, the heavy slab of stone slid outward, revealing a black void beyond. Lantern light spilled into the space, glinting off something smooth and curved. The air that drifted out was colder than the chambers, heavy with the scent of minerals and something faintly metallic. The passage led only a few meters before opening into a smaller circular room, no larger than a modest hut. Its walls were covered in a single continuous mural, uninterrupted from floor to ceiling. This was not the fragmented symbolic language of the outer chamber. Here, the imagery was fluid, narrative, alive. The mural began with a great city, its architecture unfamiliar, neither fully Egyptian nor resembling any known foreign style. Towers rose like spears, plazas spread wide, and waterways cut through in neat, straight lines. People filled the streets, men and women in long robes, carrying goods, leading animals, working in markets. Above them, the sky was painted in serene blues and golds, but as the mural's story continued, the colors shifted. A shadow crept across the sky, a deep crescent-shaped darkness, swallowing the sun. The people below looked upward, hands raised, faces turned in expressions that might have been awe or dread. The blackness deepened, and beneath it, waves of water surged into the city, swallowing the plazas, toppling the towers. Alongside the flooding, fissures opened in the earth. Fire erupted from them, painted in reds and oranges that had somehow survived the centuries as vividly as if they had been applied yesterday. The city's people scattered, some toward the water, some toward the mountains, some toward ships that waited offshore. And then came the most haunting image, a long procession of figures walking across a narrow land bridge, bordered on both sides by water. They carried children, animals and bundles on their backs. At the front of the procession was a single figure, wearing the same bronze circlet found on the ruler in the sarcophagus. His head was turned back toward the city, now half submerged, as though committing it to memory before stepping forward into exile. The final panel showed a scattering of smaller settlements in different landscapes, green valleys, dry plains, rocky coasts. Above them, in the sky, the constellations appeared once more, but not as they were above Egypt. They matched the star map in the burial goods, the same sky from 8,000 years ago. The silver-haired man stood in silence for a long time, lantern held high, tracing the painted journey with his eyes. "This," he said finally, "is not a funerary scene. It is a record, a memory of a place that no longer exists." The implications rippled through the group. If the mural was accurate, it described not just a local disaster but a cataclysm of global scale, flood, fire and darkness together. Myths from around the world speak of such events: the deluge of Mesopotamia, the sinking of Atlantis, the flood stories of the Americas, the destruction cycles of Hindu cosmology. But here, in this hidden chamber, was a depiction grounded not in mythic symbols, but in lived detail: a city with streets and markets, people in specific clothing, the face of a leader turning back in farewell. One of the archaeologists, voice barely above a whisper, asked the question that hung in all their minds: was he the last king of that place? The silver-haired man didn't answer directly. He stepped closer to the mural, stopping at the image of the procession across the land bridge. His finger hovered over the shape of the bridge itself, a thin isthmus that seemed to connect two large landmasses. This, he murmured, might explain why his blood came from elsewhere. He or his people came here because their home was gone. If so, the tomb was more than a burial site. It was a vault for memory, preserving the knowledge of a lost homeland and the disaster that ended it. The ruler had brought with him not just his treasures, but his history, hidden behind a seal so subtle it had taken weeks of work to find. The team documented the chamber in painstaking detail. Every curve of the mural was photographed, every pigment analyzed. The reds were rich in hematite, the blues from ground lapis, the blacks from carbon that dated to the same period as the main burial, confirming that the hidden chamber was no later addition. When they emerged that night, the air above the basin felt sharper, the stars more vivid. The guides kept their distance from the entrance, their eyes lowered. The younger one, who had first noticed the curse inscription, muttered in Arabic, "He came here to keep the memory alive. Now we have seen it, and that means the memory is free again." No one argued. In the following days, the image of the land bridge became an obsession for the team. Some thought it resembled the Bosporus before rising seas closed it. Others saw the shape of the land between Southeast Asia and the Indonesian islands when lower sea levels connected them. A few whispered of the Bering Land Bridge, thousands of miles away. The truth was, it could have been any or all of them. The mural had no compass, no scale, no clear label. Its only anchor was the ruler himself, walking forward into a land that would someday bury him in the sands of another world. The excavation ended the way most do, not with a moment of finality, but with the slow, reluctant packing of crates, the coiling of ropes, the last photographs taken under the thin morning sun. The tomb's entrance was covered once more. The slab slid back into place, the seam hidden under sand that the wind had already begun to move. From the surface, there was no sign of what lay below. The basin looked as it had before they came, empty, anonymous, part of the endless geography of the desert. Only the faint tracks of the camp remained, and even these began to fade in the first gusts of the afternoon wind. The team left in silence. The rumble of the trucks was swallowed quickly by distance. Each carried their own private weight, photographs stored on hard drives, samples sealed in sterile bags, notebooks filled with sketches and measurements. And somewhere in each of their minds, the image of the ruler, eyes of polished black stone, bronze circlet, a name forever withheld, would not leave them. The silver-haired man stayed behind the longest. He stood alone at the basin's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the fine sand, his gaze fixed on the line where the sky met the dunes. No one knew what he was thinking in that final moment, but when he turned to leave, he looked back only once, as if committing the place to memory. In the days that followed, the desert reclaimed its rhythm. The wind carried grains from crest to crest, smoothing sharp edges, filling hollows. Within weeks, the trench was gone. The markers, the footprints, the subtle shifts in color where the slab lay, all vanished. The Pharaoh who never was, had returned to silence. It is tempting to think of the tomb as a secret, but perhaps it is better understood as a question. Who was he, truly? A refugee king from a drowned land, the last ruler of a forgotten kingdom, a link in a chain of civilizations older than history's first sentence, or was he simply a man whose story, whatever its truth, was considered too dangerous to tell? The mural in the hidden chamber remains the most haunting clue. A city under shadow, waves and fire, a migration across a narrow bridge of earth. We can map its symbols to floods, to climate shifts, to myths told on every continent, but the mural itself does not explain, it only shows, and perhaps that is the point. Not every memory is meant to be fully understood. Some are left as fragments, to be found centuries later by hands that cannot help but try to assemble them. As night falls over the desert, the stars return, indifferent, ancient, unblinking. Orion rises, his belt bright and sharp, just as it was painted on the dome above the ruler's resting place. The same constellations shine down on the buried city in the mural, on Göbekli Tepe's pillars, on the plains where Nabta Player's stones still stand. They connect what time, water, and sand have divided. In the stillness, it is easy to imagine the ruler walking once more across the land bridge, through the green Sahara, to the place where he would build his last home beneath the earth. In that vision, he does not speak, he does not need to. The tomb speaks for him, if you know how to listen, and when the wind shifts again, it will cover the basin completely, the sand will smooth itself over the entrance, as though closing a book. It will wait. Not forever, just long enough for the world to forget once more, until the right set of hands, eyes and questions comes along to open it again. Somewhere in that unmeasured future, someone will stand in the same place, under the same stars, and feel the same pull toward the past that has no name.